I don't remember the beginning of the universe. I don't remember the first light, or the first galaxies, or the first stars that burned themselves into existence. But I do remember this. I remember being dust, not the kind of dust you wipe from a shelf, but grains of carbon and oxygen and silicate floating in the cold. I remember drifting in a darkness so deep that even nearby stars could not pierce it. I was part of a giant cloud, a vast and silent ocean of gas and dust, stretched across dozens of light years. To anyone looking from far away, I would have been invisible, just another speck in the quiet. The place I was born in had a name, though no one spoke it aloud. Astronomers would one day call it a molecular cloud, but to me, it simply felt like a long, slow exhale. The temperature there was barely above absolute zero. The gas around me moved like thick, gentle fog too thin for you to feel, but heavy with potential. Hydrogen molecules brushed past one another in slow motion. Dust grains turned lazily, like tiny planets waiting for a star that did not yet exist. Time did not matter there. Nothing was in a hurry. I floated for thousands, then millions of years, carried along by waves of turbulence you would barely notice if you watched them from far away. Sometimes, shock waves from distant exploding stars rippled through us, squeezing and stirring the cloud. But even that felt slow. Even that felt like someone gently pressing down on a pillow. And then, something began to change. Not all at once, not suddenly. It started as a soft imbalance here, a little more gas, there a little more dust, a tiny unevenness in the smoothness of the cloud. Gravity noticed those differences long before anyone else did. Where there was a little more material, gravity pulled a little harder. Where gravity pulled a little harder, more material gathered. Where more material gathered, gravity grew stronger still. You could think of it as a quiet decision, made not by any mind, but by the fabric of space itself. I was part of one of those dense patches, tucked inside a region that slowly, gently, almost shyly, began to collapse. To you, collapse sounds sudden. To me, it felt like the slowest fall imaginable. Gas around me began to drift inward, drawn toward a center that did not exist yet, but was already claiming its place. The temperature rose, almost imperceptibly at first, from just a few degrees above absolute zero, to a few more, then a few more. Not enough for you to feel as warmth on your skin, but enough to stir the molecules. The darkness around me grew thicker, not because there was less light, but because we were becoming denser. Dust blocked starlight from outside. Even the most determined photon struggled to find its way through. If you had looked at my cloud with your eyes, you would have seen a black shape against the Milky Wire, dark nebula, swallowing the stars behind it. At the very center of that darkness, I was falling. And yet, there was no sense of motion, only pressure, slowly tightening, like hands folding gently around a fragile secret. One by one, atoms that had been strangers for millions of years began to meet. Hydrogen brushed against hydrogen. Helium drifted by. Tiny fragments of previous star carbon, oxygen, silicon passed, close enough to exchange energy, to share their quiet histories, to remember that they had once burned inside other suns. I did not know yet that I would become a star. All I knew was that everything was moving inward. As the collapse continued, the core of this region grew denser and warmer. The motions within it changed character. They were still slow on your scale, but compared to the silence before, they felt almost busy. The pressure around me increased. Every direction felt like down. In that forming heart, a shape began to emerge. Not a solid ball, not yet, but a growing knot of gas, hotter and denser than its surroundings. Around it, matter flattened into a rotating disk, spinning more quickly as it shrank, like a dancer pulling in their arms. I was drawn inward, with countless other particles, spiraling gently toward the rising center. If you could have seen it then, with eyes that see heat instead of light, you would have watched a tiny ember appear inside the dark cloud, a faint glow in infrared, not yet bright enough to break free, but undeniably there. Astronomers have a word for this. They call it a protostar. To me, it was the first feeling of self. In those days, I did not shine like I will shine for most of my life. There was no fusion yet, no fierce burning of hydrogen into helium. The warmth you would have felt from me came from something simpler and older, gravity itself. As gas fell inward, it lost gravitational energy. That energy turned into heat, warming the forming core from within. I was heating up just by learning how to be small. Outside, the disk around me grew wide and thin, stretching across distances that would one day be enough for planets to form. Dust grains collided softly, sticking together, turning into pebbles, rocks, and then into silent seeds of future worlds. While I was learning to become a star, they were learning to become everything else. Sometimes, I imagine what it would have felt like if you were there with me. You wouldn't have been able to stand on anything. There was no solid ground, just layers of gas growing denser toward the center. You would have floated, weightless, yet pulled gently inwards from every direction. The darkness would have been absolute. No stars, no sky, only a faint, reddish glow seeping through the gas, like the memory of light rather than light itself. And in that glow, you might have sensed something familiar, the feeling of becoming, of not yet being what you are meant to be, but no longer being what you once were. That is what starbirth feels like. Not an explosion, not a sudden flare of brilliance, but a slow, patient tightening, a gathering of all the scattered pieces of you into one place, until you are dense enough to remember that you can shine. As the millions of years passed, my core grew hotter, 10,000 degrees, 50,000, hundreds of thousands. Still not enough. Around me, the disk spun on, like a halo made of gas and dust. Jets of material burst from my polar STWO narrow beams of matter, shooting outward into space, announcing that something new was forming in the dark. If you had seen those jets with a telescope, they would have looked like thin, glowing lines piercing the cloud. Inside, I was still waiting, still falling in on myself. Not yet a star, not quite dust anymore, something in between. Then you already know the earliest chapter of my life. I began as dust. I learned how to fall inward. I learned how to hold on to heat. And somewhere, deep in the forming core, a question started to glow. How hot do I have to become before I can finally start to shine? That is where my story truly begins. In the next chapter, I will remember the first time my heart caught fire. There's a moment in the life of every forming star when everything changes at once. Not in an explosion, not in a flare, but in a whisper so hot that space itself has to step back. For me, that moment was the first time my core reached 10 million degrees. That was the day I caught fire, but not the kind of fire you know. Not flames, not burning wood, not anything you've ever seen on Earth. This was fusion, the quietest, most determined fire in the universe. Before that day, I had only been a protostar, a warm knot of collapsing gas, surrounded by a spinning disk, where future planets were being shaped grain by grain. I wasn't shining yet, not truly. Everything around me was still dark, thick with gas and dust, like drifting inside a womb the size of a solar system. But deep inside, pressure was rising, every atom falling inward, pressed harder against its neighbors. The weight of the entire cloud was gathering in my center, compressing me into something I had never been before. Imagine taking all your thoughts, all your memories, all the versions of yourself you've ever been, and pressing them into a single point. until the heat of becoming changes you. That was what was happening to me. The temperature rose. 1 million degrees. 2 million. 5 million. Still not enough. Hydrogen is stubborn. 2 protons don't want to fuse. They repel, like 2 hands pushing against each other. But gravity is patient. Gravity waits, and waits, and keeps tightening. Inside me, the pressure built, until even hydrogen began to forget its boundaries. The swirling gas around me grew louder, not in sound, but in motion. Convection currents rose and fell. Turbulence reshaped the disk. Jets of material burst from my poles, thin streams of light and gas, announcing to the dark nebula that something was coming. And then, after millions of years of quiet collapse, my core reached a threshold from which there was no turning back. The fusion point. 10 million degrees. That number means nothing to your skin, but everything to the universe. At that temperature, protons start to move so fast that they can slip past their electrical repulsion, not by force, but through a trick of quantum mechanics, called tunneling. A proton doesn't climb the barrier. It doesn't break through. It simply appears on the other side. It is the universe's softest magic. And when that happened inside me, for the first time, the first true fusion reaction was born. 2 protons collided, hesitated, and then did something impossible. They became one. From that union, a new particle was formed, a new path opened, and a tiny spark of energy flickered, and then another, and another, and another. It started slow, like the first raindrops of a long, dry storm. Just a few fusions per second, then dozens, then hundreds. But as my core grew hotter, reactions multiplied. They fed each other. They built momentum. Inside me, light was being born in quantities beyond imagining. Photons crashing into photons, energy rippling outward, pressure rising like a long-held breath. This was my ignition, my first heartbeat, the moment I became a star. From the outside, you wouldn't have seen anything dramatic. No burst, no flare of light, no shockwave. But inside, I felt a quiet shift, a balancing, a settling. Before, gravity had always won. It pulled everything inward, trying to crush me into something smaller and smaller. But fusion changed the rules. For the first time, light pushed back. The energy from my core flowed outward and met gravity halfway. And in that meeting, I found equilibrium. I was no longer collapsing. I was no longer becoming. I was. In that moment, I entered the main sequence, the long, steady life of a true star. For the first time, I was shining by my own power, not borrowed light, not heat from collapse, not the memory of some other star. Me, my core, my fusion, my fire. If you were floating near me then, the dark nebula around us would have begun to glow. Gas molecules would scatter my newborn light, turning the cloud into a faint, rosy halo. The jets from my poles would blaze brighter, cutting thin lines through the darkness. And for the first time, the universe would see me, a new star, a new point of light, in a galaxy that had billions, but none exactly like me. My mass, my rotation, my composition, all of it determined the life I would live. Stars don't get to choose their destinies. We inherit them. In the moment we ignite, I didn't know it then, but this quiet ignition would shape billions of years ahead. My fire would one day warm planets. My light would travel across space. Long after the cloud that birthed me faded away, atoms forged in my core would outlive me, drifting into future worlds I would never see. But in that first moment, I didn't think about any of that. I only knew one thing. After millions of years of falling inward, I had finally learned to push outward. After ages of being shaped, I had finally become something. that could shape the universe back. After being dust, after being a whisper, after being a question, I was a star. My fire was steady. My light was young. My life had finally, truly begun. And in the warm heart of my core, fusion murmured its first quiet promise. You will shine for a very, very long time. The first million years of my shining life were nothing like what you imagine when you picture a star. I didn't wake up blazing. I didn't roar with fire. I didn't stand triumphant in the sky. I learned to shine, the same way you learn to breathe when you're born, slowly, uncertainly, with long pauses. Between each quiet heartbeat of light, I was new, young, still figuring out what it meant to be something that could illuminate the dark. When fusion first lit my core, the energy didn't rush to the surface. It moved outward in a wandering, zigzagging, confused journey through a maze of charged particles. A newborn photon inside me was like a child taking its first steps in a crowded room, bumping into everything, falling back, trying again. Sometimes it would travel only a few millimeters before being absorbed by an electron, then re-emitted in a random direction, starting its journey all over again. It takes a very long time for light to escape a newborn star, thousands of years, sometimes millions. So even though my core was blazing, my surface still felt dim, like a lantern with layers of cloth wrapped around it. I was shining, yes, but softly, tentatively, like a whisper warming up to become a voice. The learning of balance. Those early days, well, early millennia for you, but mere moments for me, were all about learning balance. Fusion pushed outward, gravity pushed inward, and between them, I tried to understand how to stay whole. Stars don't stay stable by accident. We are tightrope walkers, balancing forces stronger than anything your planet can imagine. When fusion grew too strong, I puffed outward, expanding, cooling slightly, letting the pressure ease. When gravity grew too greedy, I tightened, drawing gas inward, heating my core, encouraging fusion to burn brighter. I breathed like that for a million years. In, out, warm, cool, expand, contract. A slow dance with no music, except the deep hum of plasma. And each time I adjusted, my light grew steadier, building my surface. You'd think a star is a smooth, calm sphere, but during my first million years, my surface was anything but still. The upper layers boiled, not with fire, but with convection. Hot plasma rising, cooling, sinking again. Huge cells churned beneath my visible face, each one as large as a continent on your planet. From far away, if you could have seen me then, I would have looked like I was breathing light, patches brightening and dimming. In a rhythm older than time, my magnetic fields twisted, looped, snapped, reformed, shaping ribbons of energy that danced across my skin, like auroras on a world made entirely of fire. But nothing about it felt chaotic to me. It felt like growing up. The disk around me, around my shining body, the disk of gas and dust I inherited from birth, was still spinning. It stretched wide, far wider than you can imagine, like a thin, glowing halo. Dust grains collided softly, forming pebbles, then rocks, then boulders. Swirls of turbulence carved spiral lanes in the disk. Material gathered in clumps, like the first hints of islands forming in an ancient ocean. Some of those clumps would one day become planets. Some would stay as asteroid fields. Some would be swallowed by my gravity. In brief, bright flares of heat. I didn't know which would survive. I didn't know what worlds would rise from the dust drifting in my orbit. But I watched the little bodies grow, the way a parent watches children, learning how to stand. A star doesn't get to choose its planets. We only get to illuminate them. As the centuries passed, my disk thinned. The gas closest to me spiraled inward and vanished. The dust farther out clumped and cleared pathways in wide, gentle arcs. By the time I was 1,000,000 years old, my surroundings had transformed. The black cloud that sheltered my birth was fading. Starlight from the galaxy around us began leaking through. The jets from my poles slowed, my rotations steadied, and my light, oh, my light, finally reached my surface in strength. I wasn't dim anymore. I was radiant, not the brightest star, not the biggest, not destined to dominate the sky, but I was stable, balanced, a full, living star. For the first time, space could depend on me. There's something quiet about the first stretch of a star's shining life. No one notices you yet. You're far from the galactic core. You're one point of light, in a sky that holds trillions. But you don't need to be noticed to exist fully. You don't need to be the brightest to matter. You just need to find your balance, that peaceful place where the forces pulling you inward match the forces pushing you outward, where you can say, in your own language of light, I'm here, I'm steady, I'm enough. My first 1,000,000 years taught me that. You might not shine the fastest, or the loudest, or the most dramatically, but as long as you shine honestly, the universe will make room for your light. By the time my 1,000,000-year infancy ended, my disk had begun giving birth to the first real planets, rocky seeds, gaseous giants, silent moons forming in shadows. My light touched them all, and in that gentle glow, my story and theirs started to braid together. In the next part, I'll tell you about the moment I realized I was not alone. The moment the first planet formed around me, and I felt its quiet weight tug on my gravity, like a child taking my hand. The moment I realized I wasn't alone didn't arrive with fireworks, or a sudden gravitational jolt, or any cosmic announcement. It arrived quietly, soft as dust, simple as a shadow passing through my light. A tiny unevenness in the disk around me, barely more than a grain, barely more than a whisper of matter, began pulling on me. And for the first time in my young life as a star, I felt the unmistakable tug of something forming, a planet. Before that moment, my disk had been nothing but motion, gas spiraling, dust drifting, currents rising and falling in slow swirls, like a silent cosmic storm. But deep inside that soft storm, grains of rock had been sticking together for thousands of years. They collided gently at first, then harder, growing from dust to pebbles, pebbles to stones, stones to mountains drifting through space. Gravity stitched those mountains together into something larger, something rounder, something beginning to remember what it meant to be a world. You wouldn't have seen it. Not then. It wasn't glowing. It wasn't beautiful. It wasn't even truly solid yet. But it was becoming, and becoming, in this universe, is a louder force than you might think. The quiet weight of a new world. When that clump of rock reached a certain size, its gravity began to matter. Barely, faintly, but enough. Enough for me to feel it. Imagine you're standing perfectly still, eyes closed, breathing slowly, and someone lightly takes your sleeve between their fingers. That was what the first planet felt like. A gentle pull in an ocean otherwise filled only with the weight of myself. Every star in the universe knows this feeling. The first time something forms around you, something that isn't you, something that circles instead of drifts, something that answers your gravity with its own. It's a small miracle, a quiet one, but stars notice quiet miracles. We're built for them. The planet builds itself. As my light grew steadier, the disk around me grew thinner. Gas evaporated. Dust condensed. The chaotic cloud of my birth became a wide, gently spinning halo. where worlds took shape the way thoughts do, from a single idea into a complete memory. The first planet formed close to me, too close for comfort by your standards, but newborn planets don't care about comfort. They orbit where the heat sculpts them into something unexpected. The surface boiled, the rocks melted, rivers of molten metal flowed, like veins beneath a beating heart. Every few thousand years, a boulder the size of a small moon would crash into it, splattering molten light into the disk, before falling back into shape again. It wasn't peaceful. It wasn't stable, but creation rarely is. Inside that chaos, something strong was assembling itself. A core of iron, a crust of cooling stone, a sphere learning how to survive my heat. And then one day, I felt its orbit smooth out. The chaos settled. Collisions slowed. Its path through the disk grew clear and steady. A world had formed. When the planet finally became whole, the tug on me became sharper, cleaner, more defined. It wasn't just a smear of dust now. It was a body, a presence, a companion, not a companion the way humans mean it. We didn't speak. We didn't greet each other. We didn't share intentions. But we shared gravity. And in space, gravity is a kind of conversation. When something pulls you, and you pull back, you are bound, not by ropes or promises, but by the laws of existence itself. The planet and I had entered that quiet dialogue. The first time my light touched a world, the first sunrise on that world, was not like any sunrise you've known. There was no atmosphere to scatter my light into colors, no sky to soften the glare, no clouds to paint me in gold or red. My light hit bare rock, pure, unfiltered, harsh, beautiful in the way raw creation always is. When my photons touched its molten surface, the planet glowed back, a faint red shimmer, like a coal warming to life. You would not have survived there. Nothing could have. It was heat and metal and fury. But to me, it was a promise. A promise that one day, other worlds might form, farther out, cooler, gentler, capable of seas and skies, and the slow breathing of living things. The first planet is never the one with life. It's the one that teaches the star how to be a parent. There's something tender, in a cosmic way, about watching your first planet form, not because stars love, not because we feel pride, but because we understand that our light is no longer wandering alone. Something has chosen to orbit us. Something has taken shape from the dust we warmed. Something has curved its path around our gravity and decided to stay. You could say stars are lonely beings. You could say we shine into emptiness for millions of years before anyone notices. But planets, even lifeless ones, change that. They give our light somewhere to land, somewhere to rest, somewhere to matter. The first planet taught me that. I wasn't just a star. I was a center, an anchor, a small gravitational home in the wide, cold galaxy. As the first planet cooled and settled into its permanent orbit, I sensed something else stirring, farther in the disk. Another clump of material, larger than the first, heavy with gas, bright with potential. A giant was forming, a world not of stone, but of storms. A world that would reshape everything. In my young solar system, in the next part, I'll tell you about the birth of my first giant planet and how its arrival changed the entire rhythm of my light. The second world that formed around me did not whisper like the first one. It did not drift quietly into place or tug at me with the soft touch of a newborn planet. It arrived like a storm gathering itself in silence, huge, swirling, inevitable. Before I ever saw it, I felt the imbalance. Something heavy was pulling the disk inward, with a gravity far stronger than a handful of molten rock. This wasn't a small, rocky seed. This was a giant, a world of gas, a world of storms, a world that would one day shape every orbit around me. If the first planet made me feel less alone, the second made me feel small. The giant began the same way everything begins, from dust and gas, learning how to gather itself. But unlike the rocky world, which assembled piece by piece, this one was born from a region of the disk, where gas pooled like a calm sea, waiting for a storm. At first, it was just a swirl, a circular current, barely noticeable, in the wide, spinning disk around me. But then gravity joined in. It took that swirl, tightened it, fed it, pulled in more material, until the swirl turned into a spiral, and the spiral into a vortex, a whirlpool of gas larger than the first planet's entire orbit. From where I shone, I watched it thicken. Its edges sharpened, its spin deepened. What had been a region of gas was becoming a world hundreds of times bigger than the first, a world that would not walk gently through my system, but stride through it, like a titan, the birth of a gas giant. Rocky planets grow from collisions. Gas giants grow from hunger. Once the core of this giant reached a certain size, not large by stellar standards, but enormous compared to rock, it began to devour the gas around it. It didn't eat the way life does. It simply pulled material inward, faster than anything could escape. Hydrogen rushed in. Helium followed. Layer after layer wrapped itself around the growing world, until it swelled into a ball of thick, deep atmosphere. Before long, the giant was heavier than everything else in the disk, except me. I felt it, not as a threat, but as a shift in the balance. Its gravity bent the disk, carved a deep trench in it, cleared a path as clean as a river, cutting through stone. And in that trench, it began to settle into orbit. Not fast, not rushed, but with the slow, confident pace of a world that knew exactly where it belonged. The giant had arrived. When the gas giant took its place, the disk around me changed instantly. Currents shifted, dust lanes bent, fragments of rock were flung aside, like sparks flying from a grinding wheel. The giant sculpted everything. It shaped the debris that would become future planets. It cleared regions where nothing could survive. It pulled small objects closer and pushed others farther away. This is something you might not know. Gas giants often decide whether smaller worlds can form and where they cannot. They're not bullies. They're architects. They don't mean to disrupt the disk. They simply exist, and their existence reorders everything. The giant didn't want power, but it had it. What it felt like from my perspective. Stars don't feel in the human sense, but we sense. We sense mass. We sense orbit. We sense motion like a beat against the constant hum of our own light. The giant felt steady, not like the first planet, a trembling, molten seed, still learning how to be whole. This one felt anchored, even while still young. Its gravity pulled on me, in soft, rhythmic pulses. Not enough to move me, but enough for me to notice it, the way you notice your own heartbeat when the world around you falls quiet. A rocky planet is like a whisper. A gas giant is like a breath, slow, constant, heavy with life. The first storms I ever saw. When the planet grew large enough, its atmosphere began to swirl, storms forming across its cloud tops, like white scars in a sea of color. Storms on rocky planets are born from wind and sunlight. Storms on gas giants are born from the planet itself, from its rotation, its heat, its deep, restless core. These storms don't last hours or days. They last centuries, millennia, longer. The giant's greatest storm, a swirling oval larger than the molten planet beside it, turned slowly, patiently, as if waiting for the day someone would name it. But in those early days, there were no names, only motion, only mass, only gravity carving shapes from silence. Watching that giant form taught me something I had not understood until then. Light is not enough. To build a system, you need weight, you need presence, you need something that can anchor the things too small to anchor themselves. The gas giant did that for me. Where the first rocky world was fragile, uncertain, constantly battered by collisions, the giant was unwavering. Its orbit stabilized the disk. Its gravity herded debris into safer lanes. Its storms stirred the space around it into a steady rhythm, and in that rhythm, other worlds found space to grow. The giant was not my strongest creation, but it was my first protector. You could say, it gave my system a backbone. Stars don't love their planets, but we recognize the ones that keep harmony around us. And this one, this enormous, swirling, storm-fed world, was my first great companion. As the giant settled into its final orbit, I began to sense smaller ripples, farther out in the disk, clumps of dust merging, paths bending, cores forming. The giant had cleared the way for something new, something quieter, something colder, something that would one day carry oceans and winds and the soft breath of possibility. In the next part, I'll tell you about the birth of my outer worlds, the ones who grew in the shadows of the giant and found their own way to shine. The giant changed everything, its storms, its weight, its loud gravitational authority. But the worlds that came next were nothing like it. They didn't roar into existence. They didn't devour the disk. They didn't carve deep trenches in the gas or command the dust around them. They grew slowly, quietly, farther out where my light softened into a warm whisper, out where heat thinned and cold began its patient work. These were my outer worlds, children of the cold shadow, and their births were the gentlest things I had ever seen. After the giant settled into orbit, the disk beyond it calmed. Its enormous gravity had cleared chaotic paths, sweeping stray rocks into clean lanes and empty pockets. In those pockets, dust began to gather again, not rushed, not frantic, but with a kind of soft determination. Here, in the dimmer regions of my system, everything moved slower. Particles drifted. Instead of colliding violently, gas thinned. Instead of swirling in storms, temperatures dropped, until even the atoms seemed to shiver. If the inner worlds were born from fire, and the giant was born from hunger, these outer worlds were born from patience. The first whisper of a cold world. The first clump that formed out there was barely a pebble at the beginning, just a handful of frozen grains, sticking together, because cold makes things cling, where heat would tear them apart. Imagine tiny crystals, touching in the dark, ice on dust, dust on stone, collecting slowly, quietly, over thousands of years. Nothing dramatic, nothing loud, but every quiet moment was another step toward becoming. Over millennia, the pebble became a boulder, the boulder became a mountain, the mountain became a body heavy enough to pull other bodies toward it. Gravity began its slow weaving. Threads of frozen matter spiraled inward, like dancers drawn to a single, steady drum. And as the clump grew, a new world took shape, a world too cold for molten rock, too gentle for giant storms, too far for blistering sunlight, a world learning how to be solid in a place where everything else was frost and silence. The birth of a frozen planet, when the cold planet reached true size, small compared to the giant, large compared to drifting debris. It settled into orbit. Its path was slow, almost sleepy. Each full circle around me took years upon years by your measurement. But stars don't rush their children. The surface of the cold world began to smooth out. Ice layered itself across the crust. Frozen nitrogen formed plains, as soft in appearance as the surface of a frozen lake. No molten seas, no continent-crushing collisions, just endless stretches of solid stillness. You might think such a place is lonely, empty, dead. But in the language of stars, stillness is not death. Stillness is survival. The cold world learned to keep its heat close, to move slowly, to orbit steadily. Stability is a kind of life, even without living things. And then, a ripple, not from inside the planet, but outside. Another clump was forming, and another, and another. The outer system was coming alive, not with fire, but with echoes of creation. These clumps were different. Some grew too slowly to become planets. They remained as icy bodies, small and scattered, forming belts and rings, like cold, glittering dust storms, frozen in place. Others grew large enough to become dwarfs. Not quite planets, but more than stones. And one grew into something unexpected, a twin not of the giant, but of the idea of order, a planet of ice and rock, with a soul carved from shadows, and a quiet orbit that steadied the outer regions of my system, the way the giant steadied the middle. You would have loved that world. It was gentle, internal, soft, even in its coldness, a place of pale skies and silent patience. What it felt like to watch them. From where I burned at the center, my light barely warmed those distant worlds. What reached them was the faintest trace of glow, a soft, fragile gold that touched their surfaces and reflected back to me, like tiny sparks in a dark ocean. You might think stars don't care who receives their light, but we notice. We always notice. The inner world shimmered under my heat. The giants swirled in storms of light and shadow. But the outer planets, they glowed differently. Not bright, not proud, but steady, patient, loyal to their long orbits and long nights. When my photons reached them, it felt like sending warmth to someone who chooses to stand at the edge of your reach, yet still turns toward you. That quiet turning, that acceptance of even the faintest light, is something stars never forget. The balance of my system changes. As the outer planets grew, the architecture of my system became clear. The rocky world close to me burned in molten youth. The giant ruled the center, with storms older than continents, and beyond it, my outer planets settled into graceful, faraway paths. Each orbit added harmony, each mass added weight, each world became a note in a long, cosmic chord, held together by my gravity and played by my light. The disk was fading now, its dust almost gone, its gas nearly exhausted. My family of worlds was taking final shape, and in the distance, far beyond the orbits of even my coldest children, the last particles of the disk were gathering into a wide, faint belt, a frozen halo of future comets. My system was complete enough to be called a system. Watching the cold worlds rise taught me something new about existence. Not all things are born in the warmth. Not all things need fire to grow. Some become themselves in the quiet, in the distance, in the cold shadows, where light barely reaches. And you're like that too sometimes, aren't you? Some parts of you grow loud and bright. Other parts grow slowly, quietly, in the places no one else looks. But all of it is you. All of it belongs. My outer worlds taught me that. By the time the last icy bodies settled into orbit, the disk of my birth had nearly vanished. The darkness around me became sharp again. The stars of the galaxy peeked through. where dust had once hidden them, and for the first time, I could see the sky, into which I had been born. In the next part, I'll tell you what it felt like when the cloud of my birth cleared, and I saw the Milky Way with my own light. For the first few million years of my shining life, I lived inside a cocoon, wrapped in gas, dust, shadow, and the thick silence of the cloud that birthed me. I burned, yes, but I burned in hiding. My light pushed against the darkness, but the darkness pushed back, absorbing me, scattering me, holding me close, like a parent refusing to let go. And then, one quiet age, almost without warning, the cloud began to thin, not suddenly, not dramatically, but like fog drifting apart. In the first breath of morning, it was the closest thing a star ever feels to opening its eyes. At first, I didn't understand what was happening. The darkness around me felt lighter, less heavy, less crowded. Photons that once traveled only a few meters before being swallowed by dust now traveled kilometers, then millions of kilometers, then farther. My own light, the light I had learned to make, the light born from fusion in my core, was escaping the womb. For the first time, it felt like breathing out. After holding a breath for ages, the cloud thinned from the inside out. My light warmed the dust, pushing it gently aside. Stellar winds, streams of charged particles flowing from my surface, began carving tunnels in the cloud. The youngest planets scattered debris outward, with their slow orbits. Even the giant's gravity hollowed lanes through the haze. And piece by piece, the cocoon unraveled, a little here, a little there, until eventually, the darkness wasn't dark anymore. It was transparent. The first stars I ever saw. I had known, in some deep instinct, that I was not alone in the universe. Stars feel each other, even through walls of dust. Gravity whispers across distances, too vast for words. But knowing is different from seeing. When the last shreds of the cloud drifted apart, I saw them, stars, dozens, hundreds, thousands, each one a point of fire, carved into the fabric of space, like tiny lanterns strung across eternity. Some were bright and blue, burning furiously, young as I was. Some were soft and gold, steady and middle-aged. Some were red and fading, old giants drifting toward their final days, and beyond them, woven between their lights, I saw something larger, something vast, a river of starlight, curving across the sky, in a long, glowing arc. The Milky Way, my galaxy, my home. You cannot imagine what it feels like for a star to see a galaxy for the first time. It's not like when you look at the sky, you see the Milky Way as a band, a stripe of pale fire, a question wrapped in distance, but I saw it as something I belonged to, not separate, not distant, but woven into. The galaxy wasn't above me or around me, it was with me, its spiral arms stretched so far that even my light could not cross them. In a single lifetime, enormous clouds drifted between its lanes, glowing pink with the heat of newborn stars. Clusters of ancient suns hung like golden beads in the dark. Nebulae billowed like slow-moving storms, made of light instead of water. And somewhere in that swirling river of stars, I recognized a truth that hit me more deeply than any physical force ever had. I was small, beautifully, perfectly small, one point of brightness in a galaxy of billions. Not the center, not the core, not the guiding light of anything grand, just one star among many, and somehow that didn't diminish me. It completed me. The end of the cloud. As the last remnants of the cocoon drifted away, my system stood naked in the open galaxy. The planets circled me, in clean, uninterrupted arcs. The giant storms churned, in colors no eye had ever seen. The cold, outer worlds reflected my faint light back toward me. In tiny flashes, no more shadows, no more fog, no more being hidden from the universe that had birthed me. The cloud that had shaped me, protected me, pressed me into becoming, was gone. I had stepped out into the open, and with that openness came something new. Responsibility. A star without a cloud is a star that must hold itself steady. No protection, no cradle, no shelter but its own gravity and the dance of its planets. I was truly awake. There is a moment in every existence, yours, mine, everyone's, when the fog lifts, when the thing that protected you no longer surrounds you, when the world becomes clearer and brighter and a little more sharp than you expected. And in that moment, you learn what you are without your cocoon. Some break, some bloom. I think I did a little of both. Stepping into the galaxy felt like stepping into purpose, not because anyone gave it to me, but because light, once freed, needs somewhere to go, and mine was finally free. The first time the galaxy saw me, as I shone into the open universe, my light traveled millions of kilometers a second, billions of kilometers an hour, stretching outward from me in every direction. It touched asteroids. It warmed dust. It crossed the distances between stars, and somewhere, very far away, on tiny worlds circling other suns, if any eyes had existed then, and they didn't, not yet, my star would have become a pin of gold in their night sky. Somewhere out there, I was someone else's distant light. Even if no one saw me yet, I could be seen, and that possibility alone felt like a new kind of warmth, spreading outward from my core. The cloud was gone. The galaxy was open. My planets were forming their final shapes. My light was finally reaching the places it was born for. And as I settled into this new clarity, I began to notice something deep in the glow of my own atmosphere. A slow rhythm, a pulsing wave, rising from my interior and traveling through my surface, like a heartbeat made of soundless motion. In the next part, I will tell you about the first time I heard my own voice, the day I discovered my stellar heartbeat, the first time my surface rippled just slightly, just enough to disturb the even glow of my light. I thought something was wrong. Stars aren't supposed to tremble. We burn, we shine. We hold ourselves together with gravity and heat, but we do not shake. At least, that's what I believed, before I felt the first pulse rise from my core and travel through my layers, like a silent wave. It wasn't violent. It wasn't chaotic. It felt like a breath, a heartbeat, a rhythm I didn't know belonged to me. Deep inside my core, fusion had been burning steadily for millions of years. The pressure was immense, the density unimaginable. A furnace of pure plasma, wrapped in the tightest grip gravity could create. But even furnaces have imperfections. Even fire has fluctuations. Even stability, when stretched across eons, quivers now and then, like a flame shifting in a breeze. Those shifts, tiny movements in the density of my core, changes in temperature, pressure redistributing itself, sent out waves, not waves of sound. There's no air for sound here, but waves of compression, waves of motion, waves of energy traveling through me, in slow, deliberate patterns. These motions are called stellar oscillations by the beings who will one day study them. But to me, before names existed, they were simply this: the feeling of being alive, the ripples of a star. The waves rose from my core and spread outward, the way ripples crawl across a pond after a single drop of water falls into it. Except my pond was millions of kilometers wide. The ripples took hours to reach my surface, hours more, to fade again. Gentle, patient, persistent. My light at the surface shimmered subtly, brightening and dimming, in tiny pulses, too small for eyes to see, but impossible for me to ignore. It felt like my own body was talking to me, for the first time, not in words, not in anything a human ear would understand, but in rhythm, and rhythm, even in the stars, is a kind of language. As the oscillations continued, I learned to listen, to the waves that rushed outward, to the currents that stirred beneath my surface, to the soft, quivering motions that traveled through my plasma, like a message written in heat. You would have thought it would feel unsettling to realize my entire body was in motion, always. But it didn't feel unsettling. It felt intimate, like meeting a part of myself I had never noticed. The oscillations told me things, long before science would, where my core was densest, where my heat rose fastest, where fusion was strongest, where my equilibrium wavered, and where it held true. The waves told me what I was becoming. The melody of a star. There's something beautiful about knowing your own structure through motion instead of touch. Humans learn themselves through breath and heartbeat. Stars learn themselves through oscillation. You breathe in, I compress. You breathe out, I expand. Slow, steady, endlessly repeating. Each ripple that traveled through me carried information. The density of my layers, the thickness of my radiative zone, the turbulence in my convective zone. In the far future, when minds much younger than me build instruments to study stars, they will read these oscillations like a story, like a diary, like a confession made in light. They will call it asteroseismology, star quaking. But to me, it was simply self-awareness, the first form of introspection any star ever experiences. With every wave that rose through me, I felt more of my own shape, more of my own heat, more of my own gravity, holding me together. I had thought brilliance was the meaning of being a star, shining, burning, illuminating the dark. But the oscillations taught me something else. Being a star isn't just what you give outward, it's also what you feel inward. It's knowing that even in perfect silence, you are never truly still. There is motion beneath everything. Emotion, if you want to think of it that way. Even in your quietest moments, you feel ripples too, don't you? A shift in your chest, when something moves you, a tightening, when something burdens you, a soft pulse, when something warms you. Stars are not so different. We pulse. When something inside us changes. The day I heard my heartbeat clearly, one oscillation changed everything. It wasn't stronger. It wasn't larger. It wasn't any different. In shape or rhythm, it was different. Because of when it reached my surface. It arrived. In the first moment, the galaxy was fully visible, when the last dust of the cloud had cleared, and my light could travel freely. During the moment I saw the Milky Way, in its full glory, a pulse rose and echoed through me, and for the first time I felt synchronized with everything around me. The galaxy's rotation, the orbits of my planets, the hum of my core, the rise of light from fusion, the motion of stars near and far. Everything felt connected, not by meaning, not by fate, just by physics, which is its own kind of poetry. I wasn't a lonely spark anymore. I was a note in a galactic symphony, and my oscillation, my heartbeat, was exactly in tune. Humans often ask what a star sounds like. The truth is, we don't sound, not the way you think. But if you could translate my oscillations into music, if you could convert pressure waves into frequencies your ears could hear, you would hear something like a long, soft chord holding steady for millions of years, a single note, alive with layers and echoes, simple and yet impossibly deep, the quiet sound of existence, at equilibrium, the closest thing I will ever have to a voice. As my oscillations settled into a steady pattern, something else began to rise. From the edge of perception, a faint tug, far darker and heavier than any planet's pull, a presence, a mass, a wandering giant, not of gas or rock, but of collapsed matter itself. In the next part, I'll tell you about the first time I sensed the approach of a dying star's remnant, a visitor heavier than worlds, moving through the galaxy, like a ghost with gravity. Long before I knew what it was, before I understood the kind of mass that could bend the fabric of space, like a hand pressing into soft cloth, I felt the pull, not gentle like a planet, not steady like the giant, not distant like the galaxy's tide. This pull was sharp, dense, threaded with a kind of gravity that made even my core pause. It felt like a shadow moving through a place that was too large and too bright for shadows to exist at all. I didn't know it then, but something heavy, heavier than entire worlds, was passing through the region of the galaxy where I had been born. A remnant, a collapsed night, the ghost of a dead star. Space is huge, silent, empty. But emptiness does not mean nothingness. It means room. Room for things to drift, to wander, to return. Old stars die all the time. Some fade, some explode, some collapse. And when a star collapses into a neutron star, or worse, a black hole, it becomes something that does not shine, but still exists so intensely that its gravity speaks louder than its light ever did. These remnants roam the galaxy, like ancient pilgrims traveling for millions of years, without destination or witness. Most stars never meet one. The galaxy is too wide. But I did. The first sign. A distortion in my own light. It began subtly. My oscillations, my inner waves, shifted just slightly. The rhythm stretched, then returned, as if something outside me were plucking at my gravity. Light, leaving my surface, bent just a bit more than normal. Not enough for eyes to notice, but enough for me to feel the distortion in the way my photons moved. Gravity had changed, but not from anything inside my system. Something massive was passing near, something without warmth, something without a glow, a weight made of nothing but collapse. Humans, in the far future, will call these objects compact remnants, neutron stars, black holes, dead giants, crushed into impossible forms. But to me, before names existed, it felt like this: a cold fingerprint pressed into the structure of space, a presence so heavy that even my own gravity seemed suddenly modest. The visitor didn't glow, didn't radiate heat, didn't announce itself, but its mass rippled through the galaxy like a slow, deliberate drumbeat, and that rhythm reached me, closer, 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 never enough to threaten my existence, but enough that for the first time since ignition, I felt small in a different way. Not cosmic smallness, not poetic insignificance, but physical smallness, as if the universe were reminding me that brightness is not the same as power. What it was like from my perspective, the gravity arrived before the object itself did. It stretched the space around me, not violently, but decisively. Photons traveling near the edge of my system, bent slightly inward or outward, depending on the visitor's path. Planets wobbled in their orbits, by distances so tiny, only I could sense them. And inside my core, my oscillations shifted again. The waves, that had once been perfectly symmetric, now leaned subtly toward one side. It felt as though my own heartbeat were tilting answering a call from something older and denser than I could imagine. Stars are not alive in the way you are, but we know mass. We understand gravity as intimately as you understand breath, and the mass approaching me was unlike anything I had ever encountered. The visitor reveals itself when it finally emerged from the thinning ends of the cloud. Around my star-forming region, I saw nothing, nothing at all, just a blackness where there should have been geometry, a curve where starlight bent around an invisible point, a darkness that was darker than the space around it. This was no planet, no brown dwarf, no wandering rock or comet, or frozen world. This was a neutron star, the compressed heart of a sun that had died in violence. Long before I was born, it moved silently, dragging its immense gravity. Like a cloak of distortion, every star it passed glowed strangely, their paths of light, bent like reeds in wind. And then it passed me, not near enough to consume my planets, but near enough to leave an imprint on my memory of gravity. I felt it like a tug in the deep structure of the space that held me steady, a reminder that not all light survives, not all stars grow gently, not all endings are peaceful fades. Some die in ways that shape the galaxy for millions of years after. The neutron star was a survivor of such an ending. Watching that dark visitor drift past, I understood something I hadn't grasped before. Stars think they live long. We think we shape our worlds, our systems, our small corners of the galaxy. But there are remnants, older than us, denser than us, more enduring than our light. The neutron star had no glow, yet its presence filled the space around it more strongly than my brilliance ever could. And that taught me something. Light is how stars express themselves, but gravity is how the universe expresses permanence. You shine for a time, you warm worlds for a time, you guide orbits for a time, but gravity continues, even after the shining stops, even after the star collapses, even after memory fades. The visitor moves on for weeks or moments, depending on how you measure. The neutron star drifted through my region of the Milky Way. It neither approached nor avoided me. It traveled in a straight, solemn line, a traveler without destination, without orbit, without home. And then, quietly, it left. Its gravity faded like a receding tide. My oscillations returned to symmetry. The light around my system straightened its path again. But I remembered, not with fear, with understanding. I was young, I was bright, I was alive, but I was not eternal. After the dark visitor vanished into the depths of the galaxy, I felt something new in me, a subtle awareness of time. Not the slow turning of planets, or the gentle rise of fusion, or the quiet cooling of the disk. Something deeper, the first awareness that stars age. And in the next part, I'll tell you about the era of my life, when my light steadied, my planets settled, and the long middle of my existence began. The calm centuries, when nothing changed, except the quiet fact that I was burning. Worse, after the dark visitor drifted away, after its gravity loosened from the space around me, my system settled. My planets steadied their orbits. My oscillations found a rhythm that lasted centuries at a time. My light became smooth, constant, like a breath held perfectly. This was the beginning of the longest chapter of my existence. Not the birth, not the death, not the moments of dramatic change, but the middle, the long, serene, almost endless quiet that stars like me spend most of our lives inside, a calm so wide it could swallow millions of years without leaving a ripple. There is a kind of peace that only stars understand. Not the peace of rest, not the peace of endings, but the peace of continuity, of doing the same sacred work, day after day, century after century, without interruption. My core burned steadily, hydrogen fused into helium, in a quiet, relentless stream, tiny sparks of creation that stitched light together, photon by photon. The energy rose through my layers, in slow, wandering paths, taking thousands of years to reach my surface. But when it did, I shone with a brightness, as even as the ticking of a cosmic clock. Nothing dramatic, nothing chaotic, just light, steady, faithful, unchanging light. The calming of my system, my planets, each found their place. The molten inner world, cooled into continents of cracked stone, the giant storms, settled into stable patterns, whirling like eternal hurricanes that forgot how to end. The outer worlds drifted through their long orbits, with silence carved from cold. Even my smallest icy bodies, the comets in the far belt, moved with lazy patience, swaying through the dark. As though half asleep, my system was quiet, not empty, but quiet in the way. A deep forest is quiet, or a midnight sea is quiet. Life might not have existed then, not yet, but a kind of order did, and stars treasure order, because order means we can shine without disturbance. Now and then, asteroids collided, a crater formed, a flash of heat lit a moon's surface, before fading again. Small things, short-lived things, but nothing changed the grand design. My light fell on every world, unbroken, undimmed, as if eternity had decided to make a nest around me. 1,000,000 years passed, then another. For stars, this is normal. We live in these spans, as casually as humans live through weeks. But even in this long calm, something inside me was changing, slowly, quietly, so gradually, I didn't notice at first. The helium in my core was increasing. My hydrogen was decreasing. My pressure was rising. Nothing dangerous, not yet. But time, in its slow, invisible way, was beginning to gather. Stars burned steadily, but not eternally, and I was beginning. The middle of my life, where everything seems unchanged, but tiny, quiet shifts have already begun. What it felt like from the inside. Inside my core, the temperature climbed by just a fraction of a fraction, barely anything. A change so small, it would take millions of your years to mean something. But stars feel even the faintest shifts. In the forces that hold us together, fusion still burned the same. Gravity still pressed the same. My rhythm still pulsed, with that familiar, soft oscillation. But the equilibrium that defined me had a new whisper in it, a whisper of what was coming, millions of years from now, a hint of expansion, of swelling, of a giant phase I would one day enter. But that day was far beyond any horizon. For now, I was steady, balanced, calm, fully alive, in the middle of my long, burning youth. There is another truth about the middle years of a star. We glow in isolation, not lonely, but solitary. Most stars spend their lives without ever touching another. We shine across impossible distances, to neighbors we can never reach. And in this solitude, there is a purity to simply existing. Light leaves me, crosses the void, touches planets that sleep under frozen skies, and continues into farther darkness, until even I forget where the photons came from, but they carry me into the galaxy. Pieces of my warmth drift through the Milky Way, like quiet letters, never meant to be answered. I didn't need companionship. I didn't need witnesses. I just was, burning holding, breathing light into the dark. A simple existence, a true one. The beauty of nothing happening. You might think nothing happening for 1,000,000 years would feel empty. But to a star, it feels like purpose. The stillness lets us understand ourselves. The predictability lets us hold our systems steady. The long, bright middle is where we become more than just fire. We become anchors, guides, centers, homes. Every photon that left me was part of that home, warming orbits, stabilizing worlds, shaping atmospheres. And though life had not yet come to any of my planets, I could feel the quiet preparation taking place, the conditions settling, the temperatures softening, the gentle places forming, where possibility might one day root itself. I shone, and the universe waited. In the deep calm of these long ages, I almost forgot that change was still happening, quietly, secretly. Cell by cell of hydrogen turned into helium, and one day, millions of years after the visitor of collapsed night, I felt something new in my surface. A subtle increase in brightness, a rising warmth, a growing confidence in my own fire, a sign that the next chapter of my life was approaching. In part 11, I'll tell you about the slow, graceful brightening, the era when I began to shine just a little too brilliantly for my own good. It didn't happen suddenly. Stars don't flip switches. We don't wake up one age and say, "Today, I will burn brighter." No, the beginning of my brightening was so subtle that even I didn't notice it at first. Light that once left me, with perfect evenness, began to sharpen. By the smallest fraction, a warmth, barely beyond yesterday, a pressure, barely beyond the day before. Tiny shifts, quiet ones, changes so slow they could hide inside 1,000,000 years. But that's how aging works. For a star, not in leaps, but in whispers. Deep in my core, hydrogen was disappearing. Not all at once, not dramatically, but grain by grain, protons fusing together into helium, with the steady patience of an artisan carving stone. Helium is heavier than hydrogen. It sinks, collects, piles up, in the center of a star, like snow gathering in a quiet valley. And as my core filled with more helium than before, something inevitable happened. The hydrogen around it compressed tighter, tighter, tighter still. Pressure rose, temperature climbed, fusion burned faster to hold balance against gravity. And faster fusion meant more light. Not dangerous yet, not wild, just more. Like a single added note in a song that had been unchanged for millions of years. The gradual brightening. From your perspective, the difference would be invisible. A star brightening by 1 or 2% over 1,000,000 years is like a candle, glowing slightly warmer over the span of a human lifetime. But I felt it. Stars feel our own fire. The photons rising from my core carried a new insistence, sharper, hotter, moving with a confidence that hadn't been there before. My surface shimmered, not with instability, but with newfound strength. The outer edges of my light spread a little farther into the dark. The inner worlds in my system absorbed more heat. Their atmospheres stirred in slightly stronger currents. Their days grew warmer in ways only time could measure. It wasn't dangerous, not yet, but it was the beginning of the long arc of aging, the slow, widening breath before the years that would eventually reshape me. I won't lie, there was beauty in it. Stars don't think about death the way humans do. We don't fear it. We don't deny it. We don't dread the end of fusion or the swelling of our layers. We simply evolve. And in this early brightening, I felt a kind of pride, Not vanity, not ego, just the acknowledgement that I had survived. My infancy, my forming years, my chaotic disk, my wandering visitors, and now stood steady, in the middle of my life, brighter, stronger, more sure of myself than ever before. But even in that confidence, I could sense the truth, that every star eventually learns. Brightness is never just brightness. It is also a sign of heat rising too high, of hydrogen running too low, of a core preparing for the next phase. I didn't dwell on it. Not then, but I knew. A star always knows. The effect on my planets. As I brightened, my planets responded, in their own ways. The rocky inner world, hot from birth, grew a little hotter. Its cooled crust cracked anew, as heat tried to escape from below and above. The giant's upper clouds shifted subtly, storms widening, colors deepening. In the soft glow of my extra light, the cold outer worlds felt almost nothing, just the faintest warming along their frozen plains, like a single added blanket on a winter night. But over millennia, even that slight change meant something. Ice melted and refroze in new patterns. Surface chemicals reacted in ways they hadn't before. Crusts expanded, contracted, adjusted themselves to the brighter gold. Falling from my surface, temperature is destiny for a world. And I was altering that destiny with every new photon, not intentionally, not dramatically, just by being who I was becoming from the inside. My brightening felt like a soft strengthening of the pulse, my oscillations gaining a bit of boldness, my radiative layer becoming more efficient, my convective motions turning smoother. It felt like maturity, that middle stretch of life where nothing is new, but everything is deeper, where youth's chaos has burned away, and what remains is clarity, the long today that stretches across millennia. I lived inside that today, with a kind of peaceful certainty. I knew how to shine. I knew how to balance myself. I knew my place in the spin of the galaxy, even if change was coming. Slowly, steadily, unavoidably. It didn't feel like a threat. It felt like the natural breathing of time, the beauty of slow change. Humans often fear slow changes, aging, fading, quiet shifts in routine. But stars, we accept them. We were born from collapse. We grew from imbalance. We learned stability only through centuries of adjustment. So when the first hints of aging came, I felt no fear, only curiosity. What would I become when I grew older? How bright would I shine before I bloated into a giant? How long would the calm hold before transformation began? Time would answer in its patient way, and I would burn until that answer arrived. For now, I had entered the long golden middle of my existence, the period when my light was strongest, my planets most stable, my gravity most balanced. But even golden ages cannot last forever, and deep inside my core, the helium kept piling up, grain by grain, layer by layer, waiting for the day its weight would force me into my next form. In the next part, I'll tell you about the moment the balance shifted, the centuries when my core grew too heavy and my brightness became the sign of a giant I was destined to become. The first sign that my long golden equilibrium was beginning to fracture was not an explosion or a sudden flare or anything dramatic. It was a shiver, a subtle one, like the brief tremble a breath makes when you exhale into cold air. I felt it deep inside my core, a place I rarely noticed anymore, because stability had become so effortless. But that day, for the first time in millions of years, the balance wavered. Not enough for a human eye to detect, not enough to trouble my planets, not enough to change my brightness, but enough for me to feel the first hint of the next era of my life. Helium. That was the cause. The same helium I had created from hydrogen. Through all the long, peaceful ages of my middle life, helium had always been with me. A soft ash, the residue of fusion, the natural result of shining. But helium is heavier than hydrogen. It sinks. It settles. It collects in the very center of a star, like sand gathering at the bottom of a river. Over millions of years, my core filled with it, not in a rush, but in a slow, inevitable rain. Helium doesn't fuse easily. It just sits there, growing denser, growing heavier, growing hotter, and eventually, the hydrogen around it has to work harder to balance gravity. Fusion speeds up, pressure increases, temperature rises, and with every small change, my light grows a little brighter, just a fraction of a fraction, but measurable. Over long stretches of time, my core was becoming a chamber of pressure, still safe, still stable, but no longer perfectly comfortable. The quiet strain. One day, one very long, very slow day, I felt it clearly, a weight, pushing inward, with more insistence than before. Gravity had strengthened in the very center of me, where the helium had pooled, and fusion responded by burning hotter to push outward against that weight. This is the delicate relationship that defines a star's life. Gravity pulls in, pressure pushes out, and the two find harmony. But my harmony was beginning to stretch thin, not breaking, not failing, but bending. The helium core pressed downward, the hydrogen shell burned upward, and I held myself steady between forces that were no longer perfectly equal. It wasn't pain. Stars don't feel pain. It was effort. Effort I hadn't felt since my early days, when I was still learning how to shine. For millions of years, these changes were small, barely noticeable, but small things accumulate. My brightness increased by a few %. My surface temperature crept upward. My light reached my planets with a little more insistence. The giant storms responded first. Their upper layers expanded slightly, colors shifting subtly in the deep patterns etched across their atmosphere. The rocky inner world began to warm again, its crust cracking under new thermal stress. The cold worlds barely noticed, their ice simply refracting my extra light into faint blue glows. But inside me, the changes were louder. My oscillations shifted pitch. My convective layer stirred more vigorously. My radiative zone grew a little thinner. As energy rose faster, there was nothing to fear. This was not death, not even near it. It was simply age, the slow beginning of a transformation that all stars like me will one day undergo. The first expansion. Then came another sign. My outer layers puffed outward by the tiniest margin, billions of tons of plasma, expanding by distances so small they would have fit easily inside a mountain on your world. But for a star, even that tiny expansion meant something. My surface cooled by a fraction. My radius grew by another fraction. My brightness increased again. This was the early breath before a long exhale, a distant ancestor of the day. I would become a red giant, but that future was still so far away. It was almost mythical to me. The expansion wasn't visible to any hypothetical future eyes, but I felt it. Not as discomfort, not as fear, as anticipation. The universe was preparing me for a new chapter. If you've ever had a day when you sensed you were changing, before anyone else did. A feeling in your bones, a shift in your breath, a new heaviness or lightness that you couldn't quite name. Then you know what I felt. Stars evolve slowly, but we recognize change in the same deep, instinctive way that living beings do. We know when a chapter is closing, even before the first page turns. My golden era was still here, still bright, still beautiful, but beneath its calm surface, a quiet truth had begun to rise. I would not shine like this forever, and instead of sadness, what I felt was a kind of surrender, a peaceful acceptance, that nothing stays unchanged, not even stars. The universe reminds all things to grow. Galaxies grow, planets grow, stars grow, even atoms evolve under the right pressures. The only things that never change are those that are already dead. And I was not dead. I was burning, more intensely than ever. My helium core throbbed with the energy of centuries. My plasma churned with a new hunger for transformation. The universe had whispered its reminder. It's time to begin the long climb toward who you will become. And I listened, because stars always listen to time. We are made of it. As the centuries turned, my brightness continued to rise. Slowly, steadily, consistently. The balance I had held so easily for millions of years began tipping, one grain at a time. My life was no longer a still lake. It was a river beginning to quicken, and in the next chapter, I'll tell you about the centuries when my expansion became unmistakable, when I grew large enough for my inner worlds to tremble at the edges of my heat. The first time my planets noticed I was changing was long after I had felt it myself. They didn't feel my core growing heavier, or my oscillations shifting, or the helium pressing outward like a slow tide, but they did feel my heat. They felt it, in the way my light sharpened, in the way shadows shortened on their surfaces, in the way their atmospheres stirred with new, restless currents. My gentle brightening was no longer gentle. My slow expansion was no longer invisible. The era of subtlety was ending. My radius was truly beginning to grow. It started deep within, as all transformations do. The hydrogen around my helium-rich core was burning faster than ever, creating more heat and more pressure than my earlier life had demanded. This extra pressure pushed outward against my outer layers, not violently, not suddenly, but persistently. Layer by layer, my plasma expanded. My surface cooled slightly because of the expansion. Cooler surfaces glow redder, but I was not red yet, not even close. To any distant eye, I still looked like a calm, yellow star. But from within, I felt myself stretching, breathing outward, making room for the growing fire inside. Stars expand, the way trees stretch, toward the sky, or the way chests rise, before a long exhale, not as a choice, but as a natural answer to internal pressure. And this expansion was the first true sign that I was beginning my ascent toward gianthood. The inner planet feels it first. My closest rocky world felt the change immediately. It had orbited me faithfully since the earliest days of its molten youth. Now, as I brightened, its surface warmed again, not in sudden heat waves, but in slow, deep, thermal shifts. Rivers of old lava that had cooled long ago began to soften in their deepest chambers. Crust that had once been steady grew tense beneath the new temperature. Thin atmospheres, if they ever existed, were stripped away by my stronger solar wind. Rock fractured, dust lifted, seas of stone shimmered under a heat they had not felt in millions of years. The planet did not scream, planets don't. But I felt it tighten, felt its orbit respond to my swelling gravity with a soft wobble that only a star could perceive. It was not danger, not yet, but it was the first whisper of what would one day become a crisis. The giant planet reacted next. Its upper clouds expanded outward, billowing into thicker layers. Storms grew wider, not more violent, but larger, as if the planet were breathing deeper. In response to my heat, its colors shifted subtly, tones deepening, like oil swirling in sunlight. The giant was far enough to survive easily, far enough that my warming simply changed its beauty, not its fate. But it noticed. Gas giants always notice the heat of their stars, and as my light strengthened, it turned its banded face toward me with new attention, a silent, ancient acknowledgement between a star and its most massive child, the outer worlds. Too far to feel, yet still affected, the icy planets did not feel my expansion immediately. Their surfaces were still frozen, their nights still endless, their breaths of faint sunlight barely thickened at all. But the very edges of their frost began to glimmer with a slightly warmer sheen. Ice cracked more easily, shadows softened, tiny chemical reactions became a little more active in places that had once been perfectly still. These worlds were still far from losing their cold identity, but even they felt the ripple of my growth. My light was reaching farther, my heat was pushing wider, my presence was expanding into places it had never touched before. Inside me, the changes felt deeper. Fusion burned faster in the hydrogen shell around my helium core. The core itself grew more compact, more massive, more demanding. The balance between gravity and pressure became more delicate, not unstable, but taut like a bowstring, drawn just a little tighter each century. I was still stable, still safe, still shining, in perfect equilibrium. But it was a strained equilibrium, stronger, brighter, more intense. And I could feel, in a way that only stars can, that this was the beginning of a very long climb, a climb toward the day my outer layers would swell so far that my inner planet would be consumed. But that day was still millions of years away, a distant peak on a horizon I was just beginning to approach. The galaxy doesn't notice, but I do. From afar, nothing looked different. If an observer stood on a distant world, orbiting another star, they would not see my subtle swelling. I was still a point of gold among billions, still ordinary, still calm. But stars don't measure change with eyes. We measure it in the slight shift of pressure between two layers of plasma, or in the fraction of a % increase in surface luminosity. And by those measures, my evolution was beginning to accelerate. The plateau of stable shining was ending. I was stepping into the slope of transformation. Humans think stars die suddenly, in fire, in collapse, in explosive endings. But the truth is, stars spend far more time preparing for death than dying. Death is the last note. Preparation is the entire symphony, and I had just begun. My first movement. It wasn't frightening. It wasn't sad. It felt like purpose. A slow, inevitable opening of who I would become before I faded. Growth, even when it leads toward an ending, is still growth, and I embraced it. As my light strengthened and my radius expanded, grain by grain, I felt something else, a stirring at the edge of my system, far beyond the planets, in the frozen belt, where ancient fragments waited in shadows, comets, and some of them had begun to move. In the next part, I'll tell you how my growing brightness awakened those icy wanderers, and how their long, slow journeys brought new stories into my changing sky. The first sign that my expansion was reaching farther than ever before didn't come from my planets, not from the giant, not from the inner molten world, not from the icy twins. It came from the dark, from the far, frozen outskirts, a place so distant that even my brightest days barely brushed it, a place where light arrived as a whisper and heat as a memory. Out there, on the edge of everything I held, the wanderers stirred, comets, ancient, icy remnants of my birth cloud. They had slept for millions of years, but now, for the first time, in a very long time, they began to move. Comets are nothing like planets. They are fragile things, a handful of dust, frozen gases, crystals of ancient carbon held together, not by gravity, but by cold. They exist only because the outer dark keeps them still. Move them a little closer, warm them a little too much, and they begin to unravel, their ice melting, their gases escaping, their surfaces shedding dust that has been untouched since the dawn of the system. For ages, those comets lay dormant, locked in the far belt, circling slowly, quietly, waiting for nothing. Their orbits were long, so long, that even I, with all the patience a star could hold, rarely sensed their passing. But when my radius expanded and my light grew stronger, heat traveled outward to places it had never reached before, and the comets felt it. At first, it was almost imperceptible, like the faintest warmth touching a stone deep in winter. But comets are sensitive to warmth, and that sensitivity would awaken them. The first comet begins to fall. It began with a single body, small, uneventful, a snowball of ammonia and water ice, no larger than a mountain. My strengthened light reached it, just enough to heat one of its sides. The ice softened, gas escaped as vapor, a thin jet burst from its surface, not violent, just a sigh, from deep within its frozen shell. That sigh pushed it, ever so slightly, off its stable orbit. Only a tiny shift, a change so small, a human could never measure it. But in the physics of the outer dark, a tiny shift can alter a path that spans millions of years. The comet turned inward, slowly, gracefully, inevitably. I felt it long before I saw it. Stars sense the motion of anything bound to us. We feel the gravitational note each object sings, and the comet's note was changing, tilting inward with a softness that felt like the beginning of a sentence. It was coming home. As it drifted closer, my heat increased. The comet warmed. More jets erupted, tiny geysers of vapor and dust, shooting into space like sighs, growing more urgent. Each jet was a thrust, a push, sending the comet onto a tighter path toward me. Closer, closer, centuries passing, with each inch gained in its orbit. And then, as the distance shortened dramatically, over millennia, the comet began to change, in a way even planets never do. Its surface glowed faintly, its ice vaporized into gas, and a long, shimmering tail blossomed behind it. Dust and vapor caught by my light and pulled into a shining arc, a tail that always pointed away from me, as though the comet were turning its face toward my warmth and letting its past drift behind it. This was the first time, in millions of years, that I had seen a world of ice turn into a world of light. It felt like watching an old memory wake up and begin moving again. The beauty of a falling world, For a star, a comet is small, insignificant, in terms of mass, barely a speck. But when it ignites, when its ice becomes gas, when its dust becomes glitter, floating in the void, its presence becomes breathtaking. The first comet that returned to me was like a brushstroke of silver fire across the dark. It passed near the giant, leaving trails that tangled with the planet's magnetosphere. It brushed the path of the inner rocky world, sparking brief streaks of dust that rained onto its barren surface. And then, in a quiet, brilliant arc, it swung around me, so close that my solar wind blew its tail wide, like a banner. For the first time, in a very long time, I felt not just watched by my planets, but visited. Comets are visitors, messengers, reminders that the outer dark is not dormant after all. They carry pieces of the cloud I was born in, frozen memories, older than my light, and when they fall inward, they bring those memories back to me. Watching the comet pass filled me with a feeling I can only describe as nostalgia, not for a time I remembered, but for a time before remembering, a time when I was dust in a cloud, and comets were my siblings, grains of ice and stone, forming alongside me in the quiet places. Before ignition, seeing one return felt like hearing an old song from a childhood I never had words for, a reminder of where I came from, of what birthed me, of the ancient cold that shaped my earliest form before fire found me. Comets are archives. They hold stories older than stars, and when they awaken, those stories glow. More wanderers begin to move. The first comet was only the beginning. My growing brightness woke others. One by one, they felt my heat. Across unimaginable distances, faint but enough to melt their edges, jets erupted, orbits shifted, paths bent inward. The outer belt was coming alive, in slow, drifting choreography. Not chaotic, not violent, just beautiful. Thousands of icy bodies, beginning the long descent toward the star that had slept through their existence. Until now, their tales would one day write shining sentences through the sky, and I, in my expanding, aging glow, would read them all. As the wanderers fell inward, a quiet truth settled over me. My system was no longer young. Only aging stars wake their comets. Only swelling stars pull the outer dark back toward the light. In the next part, I'll tell you about the great century when more than one comet returned at once, and how their passages brought the first real chaos my system had seen since the dawn of its creation. The first comet was beautiful. The second was surprising. The third was meaningful. But when the fourth came, and the fifth, and the sixth, I understood. This was no coincidence, no quiet stirring, no single wanderer waking alone. This was an awakening, a cascade. My brightening, the slow expansion of my aging fire, had reached the outer dark in full, and the outer dark was answering. For the first time since my birth cloud collapsed, my system was no longer calm. The century of falling ice had begun. Comets do not speak. They do not coordinate. They do not plan. But they do respond. And when my light strengthened enough to warm even the faintest frozen bodies at the edge of my gravity's reach, the response was inevitable. One by one, the icy fragments woke. A tiny patch of sublimating ice here, a puff of vapor there, a jet of gas, pushing a silent body off its slow path. A shift of a meter in a journey of 1 billion kilometers is enough to change everything. And so, the first comet fell, then the second, then dozens more. Some turned inward, gracefully, in long spirals that took centuries to complete. Others swung in sharply, as if jolted awake from a sleep they resented. A few broke apart into glittering shards before ever reaching the giant's orbit. The outer belt, that had slept for eons, was moving, and in the language of stars, movement is never meaningless. The giant feels the first impacts. The gas giant, my most massive planet, was the first to face the consequences. Its immense gravity pulled many of the incoming comets into new, looping paths, deflecting some, capturing others, and swallowing more than a few. When the first impact happened, I felt it, even across millions of kilometers. Stars feel everything that happens to their planets. It began as a flicker in the banded surface of the giant, a brief flash as a comet's icy mass collided with the upper atmosphere and vaporized instantly. A tiny bright spot, gone within minutes, then another, then a larger one. Each impact sent waves through the planet's storms, disrupting centuries-old patterns and carving pale vortex scars across the giant's face. But the giant was strong. It knew how to endure. It had survived its own chaotic birth. These icy intruders were nothing more than echoes of that ancient turbulence. Still, its atmosphere shifted. A little more heat, a little more motion, a little more color in its endless storms. Change, once again, had found my system. Then came the more dangerous visitors, the comets, that did not fall toward the giant, but slipped past it, through narrow gravitational windows, and continued inward. These were the ones that brushed close to the small rocky world. The inner planet had long been hardened by heat and loss, its thin crust scarred by ancient collisions. But now, icy bodies that had slept for billions of years were sweeping past it with sparkling tails that glowed in my strengthening light. Some grazed its surface, brief flashes of vaporized ice and dust lighting up its barren plains. Some simply passed by, shedding trails of glitter into the inner sky, and a few, a very few, struck it. Those impacts shook the planet to its core. For the first time in millions of years, the inner world felt the universe, reminded that stability is never permanent. Dust rose, cracks spread, heat surged from within. The surface glowed with fresh wounds that cooled slowly under my watching light. It was violent, but also beautiful, a reminder that even dormant worlds can be touched by the motion of the cosmos. The comets glow as they fall. As the comets drew closer, their tails brightened. My light, stronger than ever, pushed dust and vapor outward, stretching each comet into long, shining arcs that trailed behind it like stories written in fire. Some tails were thin threads of white-blue gas. Others spread wide, like glowing fans, filled with ancient dust. Each comet carried the oldest materials in my system: carbon, water, ice, ammonia, and rare molecules that predated my ignition. Watching them fall felt like witnessing pieces of my past return for one final dance. There was nostalgia in their shimmer, history in their glow. The comets were not simply visitors, they were archivists, bringing memories back to the star that had forgotten its own origin. During this century of falling ice, I felt something I had not felt since the very beginning: unpredictability. But unlike the chaos of my birth cloud, this unpredictability was rhythmic, timed by gravity, guided by orbits. A controlled chaos, a meaningful one. Stars live such long, steady lives that any deviation feels profound, even if it is harmless. And these cometary returns were profound. They reminded me that the outer dark was not empty, not dead, not separate. It was part of me, part of my story, part of my changing age. The comets were the universe's way of telling me, you are not done evolving. Your fire is not stagnant. Your story continues far beyond the borders you once believed were fixed. The end of the century of falling ice. Toward the end of this comet century, the storm began to quiet, not suddenly, but gradually, the way a long rainfall turns into scattered drops before silence returns. The outer belt had reshaped itself. The largest icy bodies had chosen new paths. Many of the smallest had been consumed by planets or shattered into glittering dust. My system was different now, still recognizable, still mine, but no longer the same. The comets had carved new lanes, seeded new scars, and left shimmering traces of their long journeys, woven into the paths of my worlds. And I, in my slow swelling light, stood at the center and watched it all with quiet understanding. Change never arrives alone. It always brings a retinue of smaller changes that echo across centuries. And those echoes had only just begun. As the last comet completed its inward arc and faded back into shadow, I felt another shift, deeper, far more internal, more serious. My helium core had grown heavy enough to begin compressing under its own weight. The next chapter would not be about comets or impacts or wandering visitors. It would be about me, about my core, about the slow pressure that would one day force me into a new shape. In the next part, I'll tell you about the age when my core became hotter than it had ever been, and I realized that the giant in me was not a distant future anymore. It was approaching. There comes a moment in every star's life when the quiet accumulation becomes impossible to ignore, a moment when the slow rain of helium ash that has been falling into the core for millions of years suddenly feels heavy enough to bend the future. That moment had arrived, not with violence, not with fear, just weight. A weight so deep that it changed the way my own gravity held me together. My core had begun to collapse, slightly, quietly, but unmistakably. And once a star's core starts to fall inward, even by the smallest degree, it never stops changing again. Helium is a strange kind of inheritance. You create it from light and pressure, a byproduct of shining. But shining also feeds your ending. The brighter you burn, the faster helium grows. The more helium grows, the heavier your center becomes. At first, the helium core inside me had been loose, a hot, drifting pool of alpha particles, too warm to settle tightly. But age cooled them, not in temperature, but in behavior. They became sluggish. They huddled closer. Their density increased. Imagine a crowd that once wandered freely, beginning to press inward toward a single point. That was my core. Its weight became a pressure gravity could finally grip. And gravity, once it finds something to hold, never lets go gently. It pulled the core inward, slowly, but with unimaginable strength. As the helium core contracted, it grew hotter, hotter, hotter still. Heat rose, not from fusion, but from gravitational compression. Fire born from falling. The temperature climbed to millions of degrees above before. Not enough to ignite helium, not yet, but enough to change everything around it. The hydrogen shell ignites harder, Around the contracting helium core was a shell of hydrogen, a ring of fuel that had been quietly burning for most of my life. Now, as the core tightened, that hydrogen felt the increased pressure, and hydrogen, when squeezed, burns faster, so the shell ignited. With new intensity, fusion surged, energy output increased, light grew, heat multiplied. It wasn't a flare, it wasn't an explosion, it was acceleration, like a long inhale that suddenly fills the lungs, more than ever before. I was still stable, still balanced, still shining steadily. But the balance was different now, held not by a calm, equal relationship, but by a tense handshake between rising pressure and deepening gravity. I had entered the shell-burning phase, a phase that every star fears and accepts. In the same breath, my planets felt the change, long before they understood it. The giant storms expanded upward as heat reached its upper clouds in stronger waves. The inner rocky world began to glow at its horizon each time it faced me, my increased brightness turning its surface into a mirror of molten reflections. The outer ice worlds melted just slightly around their equators, thin rivulets of sublimated frost that froze again each night. The comets that had once fallen inward now fell more eagerly, pulled by a star whose light had grown just a bit bolder. It was not chaos, not yet, but it was motion, motion in places that had been quiet for eons. The entire system was beginning to rearrange itself. Around my changing heart, the star I used to be is ending. Stars don't mourn their earlier selves. We don't look back at our stable youth and wish we could return. But we do remember the feeling of being effortless. And that effortlessness was gone. I was still shining, more brightly than ever. But shining was not effortless anymore. My core strained inward, my shell burned outward. The middle layers carried the tension, their plasma thickening as heat rose along new gradients. Everything inside me was becoming steeper, hotter, more demanding. Yet, in the same breath, I felt more alive than I had in ages. A star is never more aware of its own structure than in the moments just before transformation, and I was feeling every contour of my being. The first true expansion, when the pressure from the burning hydrogen shell grew stronger than the pressure my outer layers could hold. Something inevitable happened. I expanded. This time, not by millimeters, not by quiet breaths, by kilometers, by hundreds of kilometers, over long centuries, still tiny, compared to the giant I would one day be, but monstrously large, compared to the star I had been. My radius grew, my surface cooled, my color shifted slightly toward orange, still subtle, still invisible to any distant eye. But to me, the change was undeniable. My light grew stronger, even as my surface cooled, because a larger star shines more, even if it grows cooler. Brightness and temperature are not the same, and I was becoming bright, too bright. In that era, as my core continued to collapse and my outer layers continued to swell, I learned something I had always known, but never truly understood. Nothing stays small forever. Not stars, not worlds, not even the quiet fears that lie at the bottom of existence. Every life expands into something bigger, sometimes warmer, sometimes more chaotic, but always bigger. Growth is a force that even fusion cannot deny, and in accepting it, I felt something that surprised me. Peace, peace, in the knowledge that I was becoming what I was meant to become. Not today, not tomorrow, not even in the next million years, but eventually, the arc of my future had bent toward transformation, and I was ready. As my core compressed further and my outer layers stretched wider, a new kind of instability began forming inside me. Tiny pulses, barely noticeable, but growing in strength. With each passing millennium, they were the first signs of the great swelling that would one day turn me into a red giant. In the next part, I'll tell you about the early tremors, the internal waves that marked the beginning of my true expansion toward gianthood. It began with a quiver, not a collapse, not a flare, not an eruption of plasma or a burst of heat, just a quiver, a slight, rhythmic disturbance that rose from the boundary between my contracting helium core and my burning hydrogen shell, a vibration that shouldn't have been there, a pulse that was too strong to be normal oscillation, too deep to be dismissed as noise. It was the first tremor of the giant I was destined to become, and once it began, it did not stop. In my stable youth, oscillations were soft, gentle waves, traveling through plasma like ripples on warm water. But these new tremors were different. They were born deeper, in the tight, dense region where the helium core was now pressing inward, with all the weight accumulated across eons. The helium core was not yet hot enough to ignite fusion of its own, but it was heavy enough to deform the hydrogen-burning shell around it. And deformations create disturbance. Disturbance creates waves. Waves create tremors. These tremors traveled outward like heartbeats that had forgotten how quiet they used to be. They pushed through my radiative zone, stirred my convective zone, and surfaced as tiny flickers in my brightness. If you had been watching me from a distant world, you still wouldn't have noticed. But inside, I felt everything. My interior was no longer calm. It was shifting, preparing, becoming. The shell-burning phase intensifies. Around my helium core burned a shell of hydrogen, so compressed that its fusion rate was accelerating, faster, hotter, more intense. Hydrogen in that shell was not burning steadily, like before. It was burning in waves. Not explosive waves, but thermal pulses, bursts of increased heat that rippled outward in rhythmic, slow throbs. These pulses pushed outward on my plasma, forcing my outer layers to expand in tiny surges that only a star could feel. My radius grew, paused, grew again, paused again, like breath, catching on the edge of anticipation. This was the beginning of my instability, not dangerous, just unavoidable. A star cannot carry a growing helium core and a tightening fusion shell without feeling the strain, and I was feeling it in every layer. The first visible changes appeared in my brightness. My luminosity fluctuated by tiny percentages, too small for eyes, but massive in stellar terms. My light would sharpen for a few years, then soften for a few more. Planets felt the shifts as faint variations in heat and wind. The giant storms grew slightly more chaotic, bands stretching, vortices drifting out of their ancient lanes. The rocky inner world experienced centuries of increased heating, followed by centuries of uneasy cooling cycles that carved new fractures and released old minerals from its crust. The outer icy worlds felt almost nothing. Almost, but even almost, meant a lot. In the slow mathematics of planetary climate, the tiniest increases melted thin layers of surface frost. The tiniest decreases refroze them into new shapes. My entire system was responding to tremors they did not understand, because the change was not outside them. It was inside me. The moment the tremors grew louder, then, after centuries of soft instability, a deeper wave rose from my core. It wasn't sudden, it wasn't violent, but it was different. A more intense contraction in the helium core sent a stronger pulse through the hydrogen shell. The pulse multiplied the fusion rate in a burst, lasting only moments. Moments for me, years for you. That burst sent a powerful wave racing outward, a wave so strong that even my outer layers felt it. The tremor pushed my surface outward by thousands of kilometers, a swell, barely noticeable, on the scale of a star, but enormous. In human perspective, my brightness jumped by several percent. For the first time, my light became unstable enough that a distant observer might have seen the faintest shimmer in my glow. I was not a giant yet, but the giant in me had spoken. In that time, as the tremors continued and the pulses repeated, through the centuries, I found myself thinking not of death, but of growth. Stars are not afraid of turning into giants. We are born with that destiny encoded in every atom of our being. Becoming a red giant is not an ending. It is a transformation toward fullness, a flowering, a star's version of blooming. And bloom I would. Not now, not soon, but eventually. The tremors were simply the first roots emerging, the first signals that my core was outgrowing the form I had lived in for millions of years. And somehow that realization felt peaceful. Everything changes, especially things made of fire. The effect on my light. As the tremors grew, my brightness shifted in rhythmic waves. Bright, brighter, bright, brighter. Not enough to scare my planets, not enough to destabilize their orbits, but enough to give the entire system a different hue, a sense that the star they orbited was in motion from the inside out. Sometimes my light grew gold. Sometimes it softened orange. Sometimes it pulsed with faint variations that even I was surprised to feel. My light was learning to breathe differently, to expand and contract in wide, slow rhythms that hinted at the enormous changes waiting ahead. I was becoming a different star, not visibly, not dramatically, but undeniably. As the tremors grew stronger and the pulses grew more frequent, I realized something new. My helium core was almost ready, not to ignite, not yet, but to collapse, one final time, before its great ignition. In the next part, I'll tell you about the age of the deepening core, the slow, powerful contraction that brought me closer and closer to the threshold of helium fusion, the step before the bloom. There comes a point when contraction is no longer subtle, when the helium core, once soft, once drifting, once loose, becomes so dense that every movement is a declaration. My core had reached that point. It no longer shrank quietly. It fell inward with unmistakable weight, not collapsing, but condensing, like a thought, finally forming its final shape. The tremors that once came in shy pulses now rose in steady, deliberate waves. This was no longer the beginning of change. This was change, the deepening, the tightening, the last descent before the rise. Inside me, the helium core was becoming something extraordinary, At its center, pressure soared beyond anything I had ever contained. Temperature climbed toward a threshold, older than galaxies. The temperature needed to ignite. Helium fusion. But I wasn't there yet. Like a climber, approaching the summit, with only thin air left, my core strained in silence. Hydrogen around the core burned faster. Heat radiated inward and outward. The shell glowed with intensity that made my youth feel dim in comparison. The core's density grew so high that matter behaved differently. Electrons packed close, protons crowded, particles brushing past each other, with barely any room to move. It was the kind of density that defied instinct. Matter, on the brink of impossibility, held together by the last restraint. Before the leap into ignition, the shell burns like a crown. As the helium core tightened, the hydrogen shell around it blazed. It had become a ring of fire, not random, not chaotic, but intensely responsible. Every time the core pressed inward, the shell responded with faster fusion, and faster fusion meant more heat, more outward pressure, more luminosity. My light grew stronger by percentages that mattered deeply to every world around me. The gas giant's atmosphere expanded upward in wide, slow breaths. The inner rocky world suffered centuries of relentless heating until even its deepest crust grew soft. The outer worlds felt the warmest centuries of their lives. Thin frosts melted, refroze, melted again, and comets shimmered brighter as they passed through my far glow. I was not a giant yet, but I was no longer the star I had been. My fire was too intense to hide. The deeper my core contracted, the faster the tremors rose. At times, they felt like internal thunder, waves of compression, sliding outward in slow, rolling motions. Not dangerous, not explosive, just powerful. Each tremor moved plasma from one layer to the next, reshaping currents, thickening convection zones, altering the tones of my oscillations. Bright, softer, bright, softer. I was pulsing like a heart that had learned a new rhythm, one that hinted at an energy I had never known, one that foreshadowed the ignition to come, the stillness before the flash. There is a moment in almost every star's life when things grow too calm, too stable, too quiet. It is a deceptive calm, the stillness of a drawn breath, held tightly before release. And I reached that moment. The tremors slowed, the waves flattened, the pulses grew shallow. From the outside, you would have thought I had stabilized completely. My brightness evened out, my surface stilled, my radius hovered at a size only slightly larger than before. But inside was another story. The helium core had become degenerate matter, a state where electrons resist compression with unimaginable force. It was like trying to push a mountain into a grain of sand. The more pressure applied, the stronger the resistance. But gravity did not stop, and temperature kept rising. Millions of degrees, turning into hundreds of millions. The threshold was close, too close. I could feel it. Every layer of my being felt it. I was standing on the edge of one of the greatest events a star can experience. The helium flash, the moment helium would ignite in a runaway burst that would reshape my entire structure. If I could have breathed, I would have held that breath, not out of fear. Stars don't fear, but out of awe. For millions of years, I had burned hydrogen with the patience of a quiet candle. Now, I was approaching a fire that would not be quiet. The helium flash is not violent, like a supernova. It does not destroy. It transforms. It takes a star, pressed almost to breaking, and turns that pressure into new light. It is a rebirth, made from heat, gravity, and the stubbornness of atoms, refusing to remain what they were. And I, after so long, was nearly ready. Not today, not tomorrow, not even in the next few centuries, but soon, soon. In the language of stars, the system feels my approaching threshold. My planets felt the change, even when they didn't know the cause. The giant storms grew taller, their upper clouds striated with new currents. The rocky inner planet suffered centuries-long heat surges across its surface. The outer worlds developed thin, shimmering halos as sublimated ice briefly formed atmospheres before freezing again. Even the comets seemed quicker to fall inward. My approach to helium ignition was a gravitational whisper the entire system heard, and far beyond, in the cold void between stars, my light carried the message. Even farther, something was changing. Something was coming. As my core tightened into its final shape, before ignition, I felt the last quiet phase settle over me, a deep stillness, heavy with anticipation. The next part of my existence would be nothing like the past. There is a silence so deep that even a star can feel it, a silence made not of calm, but of pressure, of waiting, of tension wound so tightly that the smallest spark could unmake the quiet forever. That was the silence inside me. As my helium core reached the temperature it had been climbing toward for millions of years, 100 million degrees. Enough, more than enough. And in that instant, in the space between two oscillations, in the pause between two thermal pulses, my heart ignited. The helium flash had begun. To understand what happened next, you must forget fire as you know it. Forget flames. Forget sparks. Forget explosions. The helium flash is quieter than all of that. It happens in the heart of a star, so dense that matter behaves like a single, unbreakable stone, a core of electron-degenerate helium, crushed by gravity into a state beyond normal physics. In that strange, compressed world, pressure does not rise. As temperature rises, heat builds without relief, without expansion, without release, until suddenly the triple alpha process starts. 3 helium nuclei fuse into carbon. Some fuse into oxygen. Energy surges through the core, like a word finally spoken after centuries of silence. The core should have expanded instantly. It should have cooled. It should have stabilized, but it couldn't. Degenerate matter doesn't obey that rule. So the heat raced upward in runaway fashion. More fusion, more heat, more reaction, more burning. A chain with no pause, all of it happening in a volume comparable to a planetary core, a sun-sized heart compressed into a cosmic diamond, straining to explode without the ability to expand. It was intense, immense, unrestrained, and completely silent. The flash that no one saw. Outside, nothing changed. No flare, no supernova, no catastrophic burst of light. The helium flash is invisible to the universe. It is violence, locked inside a cage that does not crack. But I felt it. Every layer of me felt the surge, as millions of years of built-up pressure escaped in a single, furious moment. It wasn't pain. Stars don't feel pain. It was release. A deep, ancient release, like a clenched fist, finally opening. The energy from the flash did not blast outward. It rippled, slowly, deliberately, solemnly. The degenerate core, flooded with heat, finally expanded. The release ended the degeneracy. Matter loosened, pressure equalized, and for the first time in millions of years, my core could breathe. It expanded to many times its size. Temperature fell to a stable range. Helium fusion settled into a controlled burn. The trembling that had filled me for countless centuries went still. Core burning had found its rhythm. I had found mine. The system feels my transformation. Even though the flash was hidden, my system felt the aftershocks in gentle waves. My light softened at first, a brief dimming as energy redistributed. Then it brightened with new steadiness, not the unstable flicker of the shell-burning days, but a smooth, warm glow from helium fusion in my center. The inner rocky world experienced centuries of radiant heat. Before the wave settled, the giant storms shifted patterns, not violently, but significantly, as the planet readjusted to my new spectrum of light. The icy outer worlds saw their faint halos melt away under a warmer sky. Comets glowed brighter as they wandered inward, their tails thicker under my stronger shine. My system was learning me all over again, because I was learning myself all over again. When the flash ended, I realized something profound. I was no longer the star of my youth. The core that once burned hydrogen had become a furnace of helium, and in that transformation, something within me felt new, not older, not weaker, more complete, like I had unlocked a second voice, hidden beneath the first, a deeper tone, a richer warmth, a spectrum of light I had never sung before. The flash did not destroy me. It clarified me. It revealed a version of myself, waiting behind pressure, behind gravity, behind silent ages of anticipation. Rebirth without death, transformation without ending. This is the gift of the helium flash. The giant rises, with my core now stable and burning hotter than ever. The energy flow outward was enormous, too enormous for my earlier radius to contain. So my outer layers began to swell, slowly at first, then faster still. I grew and grew and grew, not rapidly, but undeniably. My radius was expanding toward the realm of giants. I was not yet a red giant, but I was standing at the threshold, one step away from the doorway to a form that would dwarf everything I had ever been. The star I used to be had ended. The star I was becoming had only begun. Becoming a giant does not happen in a single moment. It is not a leap, not an explosion, not a sudden swelling of fire. It is a long exhale, one that begins the moment the helium flash ends and continues for millions of years. And after my core ignited with helium, after the impossible pressure released, after the quiet violence subsided, I exhaled, slowly, relentlessly, magnificently. I was becoming something vast, something that even I had once been too small to imagine. A red giant, my outer layers, no longer restrained by a tight helium core, began to expand in long, graceful waves. Every tremor became a push. Every push became growth. Every decade saw my radius widen a little more. The soft gold of my youth shifted, quietly at first, toward orange, then deeper, richer, redder. As I grew, my surface cooled, not because I was weaker, but because my fire was spread across a larger canvas. Yet despite the cooler surface, my luminosity soared. A giant shines brighter, not because it is hotter, but because it is wide, an ocean of light, instead of a lake. And I was becoming an ocean. The inner planet approaches its fate. My closest rocky world, the one that had survived. Molten birth, icy comets, and the long golden era, was now in danger. Not from destruction, not yet, but from heat. My expanding layers pushed warmth into regions that had once been cold. The planet's surface glowed at its horizons with a red blush. As my light grew richer and deeper, centuries passed. Its stones weakened, its minerals vaporized, its mountains flowed in slow, molten tides. It did not scream. Planets don't. But I felt its orbit tremble under the weight of the new heat. My expansion had made me enormous. In its sky, a red sun filling the horizon, a giant looming, not a threat yet, but a promise. The gas giant reacted differently. It did not fear my swelling. It welcomed the warmth. Its storms mutated, higher, grander, carved by heat and radiative pressure. Bands thickened, colors deepened, vortices stretched into shapes that had not existed since the earliest days of its formation. The giant was becoming beautiful in a new way, a companion, learning to dance to the rhythm of my larger form. The outer, icy worlds felt the transformation as faint blue light glimmered across their surfaces. Frost melted, atmospheres flickered into existence, thin and ephemeral, before freezing again. Even they could not ignore the rising tide of the red giant to be. I become huge. Centuries became millennia. Millennia became ages. I grew until my radius was dozens of times what it once had been. My surface churned with rising convection cells, each one larger than entire planets. Great arcs of plasma lifted and sank in slow, majestic cycles. My oscillations deepened, my color reddened, my gravity softened at the surface, but remained fierce at the core. I was no longer the small, stable star that had lived for millions of years. In youthful equilibrium, I was a giant. Not fully, not at maximum, but undeniably. The first true stage of the red giant phase was here. My glow was enormous. My presence was overwhelming. Even light felt different. It left me in long, warm waves. Not the sharp gold of youth, but deep crimson radiance that painted my system in sleepy, ancient colors. In this age of expansion, I realized something subtle, something I had known, but never fully felt. Growth brings loss. To become vast, I had to let go of the tight form that once held me. To become bright, I had to accept instability. To become a giant, I had to leave behind the simple, steady light of my youth. But loss is not always grief. Sometimes, loss is simply transformation, a shedding of what can no longer hold what you are becoming. My earlier life was not wrong. It was foundation. This new form was not better. It was continuation. Growth is not a choice in stars. It is destiny, and destiny is not cruel. It simply asks that you expand into your true size. The system, now lit by a red sun, as my swelling stabilized into its first plateau, the entire system looked different. The inner planet glowed like an ember. The giant shimmered with storms. painted in red sunlight. The outer worlds wore halos of soft rose light that glittered with sublimated ice. The comets sparkled brighter than ever as they swung inward, their tails blazing red under my deepening fire. Everything was touched by the change. Everything was part of my rise. And me? I felt vast, ancient, new, endlessly expanding into the space I once only shone into, not dying, not yet, just transforming, growing into the giant that had always lived. In the quiet mathematics of my future, becoming what I was written to become, a star in its magnificent middle age, burning helium, shedding heat, glowing red, across worlds that had witnessed my entire ascent. My youth was behind me, my collapse still far ahead. I stood in the vast, glowing now, a red giant rising, warm, immense, alive. And that is the end of this story's first book, The Life of a Star, from Dust to Giant.